So thank you for joining us today. My name is Daniella. I am the training manager for crisis support services for the crisis line, and I'm accompanied by my wonderful co-host.
Hi everyone, I'm Cici. I go by she, her pronouns, and I manage the text line program at Alameda County Crisis Support Services.
And we're going to be talking today about assessing for risk using phone and text. First, we want to start out with a land acknowledgement. Right now, we are here, Cici and I are here at Crisis Support Services, which is on Ohlone land. We're on unceded land, and so it's important going into this work, recognizing where we are to help orient us to where we're going. So today we're going to review suicide assessment questions that we use when we train folks to assess over the phone and over text. We know that there are many different folks in the room with us, some that are providers, clinicians, counselors, family members, loved ones. And so we're going to try to tailor this for everyone. And then we're also going to go over how to respond to level of risk. So depending on getting the type of suicide assessment that's going to help us understand what risk people are at, will help us determine how we support folks in getting the support they need based on that risk. And then also how to deal with helper anxiety, right? This topic can bring up a lot for folks. It can bring up challenges around knowing how to respond. Did I do enough? Do I feel comfortable? And so we're going to address that. And so while we are not going to talk about different reasons why folks might be feeling suicidal, though we know that's important, right? Many different things are suicide prevention: access to housing, access to food, access to healthcare, basic needs, as well as other things that people are experiencing. Our hope is that you walk away with tools on learning how to assess and how to respond. First, we want to start out with a question to the room, and if folks feel comfortable, you can unmute yourself or share in the chat. But we want to orient ourselves first around thinking about asking about suicide, or asking ourselves how we feel. So why do you think it's important to explore our own personal feelings and biases around death and suicide first?
Are we sharing out loud?
Yeah, you can share out loud or share in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Oh, I guess I unmuted myself. Hi, Irais Sevillano. I am a behavioral healthcare clinician too at Eden Children's Services. So for me, it has to do with your comfort of asking the hard questions. And if there's discomfort in asking the hard questions, and the youth or any other person you want to ask the hard questions to will pick up on it, the hesitation, the fear, and they could that could determine their level of disclosure or trusting to be honest about what's really happening. If they feel or sense that you're not able to hold it, or are too afraid to have them say the truth.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was so well said. People pick up on our responses, right? How we're going to respond and how we talk about it can also set the stage for other people, how other people will respond, or if this is okay to talk about. Anybody else, any other thoughts on why it's important to first look within? Right, you're welcome to put it in the chat. But our own anxiety about discussing suicide might be misinterpreted, right? So it's really important to be mindful of how we respond can set the stage for how another person might feel about whether they want to open up or not, or if they do feel comfortable about expressing their thoughts on how they feel or their thoughts on suicide. So in how we choose to respond, we're working to end stigma. We are being mindful of the word choice we're using. We're showing folks, we're talking about it. It's okay to talk about it with us. So we're naming something, even if, right, we don't know how people feel yet. Just asking the question and choosing to respond and being mindful of the language we use can help facilitate that. If we jump to conclusions based on our own fear and anxiety, we might be completely missing what the other person has to share. Sometimes people feel that if somebody says yes, we're jumping to, oh no, is this a safety issue? Is there a safety concern? What do I need to do next? And we're so busy thinking about what the next move is that we often forget to sit with the person. And if we take action based on these conclusions or based on our fear or anxiety, we might end up perpetuating stigmas in ways that we're not trying to, right? Or we might end up engaging in unnecessary services or utilizing services where that might not be warranted or needed and could perpetuate harm despite the best of intentions. And it's really important to remember that just because someone has thoughts of suicide does not mean that they will go on to die by suicide or they're in imminent danger. A lot of people experience suicidal ideation. They have thoughts of death or thoughts of suicide, and that doesn't mean that everyone that has those thoughts go on to die by suicide. There's a big range.
In order to create an inviting space for someone to feel like they can share their story, we want to make it known to the client that the focus of our conversation is on their experience because we care and want to learn how these feelings came about for them. And we can do this by using different forms of active engagement that we can apply throughout the conversation, which we'll be referring to today as ORs, standing for open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summarizing. And it's important to respond with a balance of neutrality and a level of emotional awareness. Actions like making assumptions and quick judgments or presenting an opinion that's different from what the client may be feeling could come off invalidating. So we want to make the focus on listening to them to learn what's within their preferences and limits. Next slide, please. But how do we want to actually assess for safety when someone is disclosing thoughts of suicide? I'll be going over risk factors and what to look out for and considerations and breadcrumbs as we are considering these questions. Suicide is the result of psychological, biological, societal factors, and its risk can be based on feelings of being a burden, lack of belonging, and this can all stem from lack of access to basic essential needs. There's more chronic risk factors like experiences that normalize pain, if any non-suicidal self-harming behaviors are being engaged with. And there's also many factors that can also increase crisis, a lack of access to housing, healthcare, and food. Acute risk factors refer to things that are happening more recently, maybe triggered by things that just transpired for this person in their life, and could be a monumental difference in their day-to-day, such as losing a loved one, or other things that may transpire from poor coping with current stress that's ongoing, such as with using substances or a lack of sleep. Next slide, please. And some warning signs to look out for could be rehearsing behaviors can be lethal, such as have they been practicing anything that going through with their plan and trying to see if how comfortable they feel with it, or driving to a certain place and seeing if there's a certain time frame to go when it's best to go when there's no one there. So things like if they have a plan, means, timeline, or what they could be doing to evade the steps of stopping their attempt from happening.
But we want to be mindful that risk factors don't reliably predict who will die by suicide, or that because somebody's experienced that means they are going to be suicidal. It just means that they might be at higher risk, but everyone experiences suicidality differently. Everyone's experience with that is idiosyncratic or unique to them. So therefore, it's really important that we rely on the rapport and relationship we're building with our callers, texters, community members, clients, patients, right? And the information they provide us so that we can get an accurate suicide assessment. That's going to dictate how we can work with the person to see what's going to be most supportive. And so there's things we want to listen out for, right? Regardless of risk factors. Someone might not experience any risk factors and still experience a state of crisis or suicidal crisis where they might go on to hurt themselves. So we want to think about this. So if we're hearing things like folks saying they're feeling like it's too much, it's overwhelming, I don't know what to do, I'm feeling alone, I don't belong here, they'd be better off without me. We want to listen to these clues, or what we call breadcrumbs, to start thinking about formulating an assessment. We also want to be really mindful that when we ask an assessment that we're being direct, while we're also being empathetic and collaborative. but also that sometimes asking direct questions can bring up discomforting feelings. So again, being mindful of how we're choosing to ask, the language we're using, and responding really supportively. So with this, we do this two-pronged approach, right? We're providing empathy while we're gathering information.
And it's important to have a two-pronged approach as well when we're asking questions, the aspect of providing empathy, because especially when people who are opting in via text or just texting to let us know that they're in crisis, a lot of people who text are youth and can be very easy in falling into an interrogation, a question answer type of format where after the end of the questioning, and going back into asking, okay, tell me more about what's going on, they might feel more closed off. So we do this two-pronged approach of pairing empathetic reflections and affirmations with
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, and I think this, to your point, Cici, of it feeling like an interrogation, oftentimes, we'll remind people after you ask a question, like respond to what somebody said, because it can feel disingenuous or that you're just checking off a box. And sometimes when people are feeling nervous or the helper is feeling anxious, they want to kind of get through the assessment because they're really worried about safety. But we're also assessing for how someone's doing, and that's part of our assessment just by hearing and responding. That'll help someone open up about talking about how they feel. So we do have criteria that we use to assess for risk, and that's desire. So if they have a desire or a thought, a history. So what is their history of suicidality or any previous attempts? Do they have a plan? Is this just a thought that comes and goes with no real plan? Or have they started to think of, well, how would I end my life? The means, do they have what they would use to end their lives, right? Like you can have a plan, but do they have what they need to carry out that plan? And the timeline is really important, right? Is there a difference between tonight, tomorrow, in the future, if I fail this test after my divorce is finalized? Protective factors are also really important because as we're talking about risk, we can't just think about that alone. We also have to think about what protective factors, things that are life affirming, access to social support. Thinking of the things that support people and help them stay safe is a really important criteria when we're considering overall risk and their access to those protective factors.
It's important to use direct, closed-ended questions when we're assessing for suicide. Sometimes when people have been going through these types of painful experiences, they start to think about suicide. Have you been having any thoughts like that? And we use open-ended questions when we're exploring the story, when we're doing collaborative problem solving. But in the assessment piece of wanting to know about their safety, it's important to use direct questions. And we usually ideally combine that with the ors of reflection or affirmation with that questioning. I'm hearing just how overwhelming all of this has been for you and has wondering if you're having any thoughts of killing yourself.
When we're asking about suicide, we want to use really specific wording. We don't use words like commit suicide. We're being mindful that that can perpetuate stigma. And we want to work to end stigma because when we think of commit, right, what comes to mind, like committing a crime. So we want to use words like kill yourself, end your life, take your life, and being really mindful. Asking a suicide assessment, just saying, are you thinking about harming yourself? That is not necessarily a direct question about suicide, right? So we want to be really mindful to split hairs on that. And again, it's modeling that it's okay to talk about it with me. Like, let's talk about it. I want to support you in naming that. Are you feeling that way? So there's different ways people can respond. And so oftentimes, sometimes we might be saying things that we think are helpful when there might be another way to say what we are hoping to communicate in terms of our support. So Cici's going to help me with this. So instead of saying,
I'm glad you're not feeling suicidal.
when someone's not feeling suicidal, we want to say, thank you for telling me. Can you tell me more about what you're feeling right now? Because sometimes
And
people go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, sometimes people don't realize when someone says no, and you say, oh, I'm so glad you're not feeling that way. We're perpetuating the idea that, okay, because I'm relieved you're not suicidal. It's good you're not feeling that way. So is the opposite that when you're feeling that way, that's not okay, right? So we're really mindful about the language we use.
And that just because someone is saying no to having thoughts of suicide, it's just inviting them to, like, okay, I hear that, is responding with a neutrality, like that you're not feeling this way today, but still inviting them in case, for especially for youth, they may feel pressure to lie initially and not know what may happen from answering truthfully, the consequences. So it's also important for why we prioritize neutrality in responding. And instead of saying something like, you shouldn't feel that way, you have so much to live for, to someone who's a youth who may feel even more invalidating to hear that or what they're going through, we want to
Yeah.
say something like,
I can hear the pain you're experiencing. It makes sense you feel that way, right? Oftentimes people are experiencing something that's a typical response to an atypical situation. We want to validate how they're feeling.
and instead of saying something like, don't worry, you'll get over it,
And say, your feelings are valid. I hear how much the situation has affected you. We want to lean into the discomfort. We want to not shy away from what they're saying. Oftentimes a response can want to feel like, don't think that way. You have so much to live for. It's okay. Why would you feel that way? When really we want to facilitate the conversation. Like, thank you for telling me. I hear how you're feeling. This is valid.
suicide is a serious feeling, and just like any other feeling, it can come and pass, but our objective here, to our priority, is not in wanting the client to feel like we're moving past this. It's more so of just sitting with them in that moment of like, this is what's happening and I'm here with you now and I hear this. Next slide. Oh yeah, okay. And also will be, if they've answered yes to having thoughts of suicide, and they have, we will also want to ask, is this a feeling that's been new for you, or have you felt this before? And sometimes when people are stressed out and as depressed as you've been feeling, they tell me that they sometimes have thoughts of killing themselves. I'm wondering if you've been having any thoughts like that recently. So you want to get a gauge of how long has this been going on for them. Did it just happen today, or is this happening over a period of time? Or if it has happened before, have they had any past attempts? Next slide, please. And if they've answered yes to having thoughts of suicide, and yes, they may have thought of it before, we also want to ask, have you been thinking of any ways to end your life? And wanting to reframe too, of sometimes saying the word plan may not always resonate with the client too, that sometimes suicide is just an impulse that just happens in that moment. It's not something that can be really thought out sometimes. So just asking too, of ways to end your life. Have you thought of how you would do this? And combining that with an ORS of, it sounds like suicide is something that you've been giving a lot of thought to recently and at other times in your life also. When you're feeling suicidal, do you think about how you want to die? And we also want to ask, if they have thought of a plan or have thought of a way to die, do they have access to it? Do they have the means to follow through with their plans? Have they thought of steps to accessing it? How can they get access to it? And are there any barriers to time, resources, people, or any events to them getting those means?
Mhm. We also want to be mindful of asking if someone's done something to hurt themselves already. Oftentimes when people are saying, yes, I have a plan. Yes, I thought of when. Sometimes people often forget to ask, like, if something's already happened. And I know for over the phone and over the text, if we do hear that someone at least has access to the means or what they would use, or they're about to engage with it in some way, or it's readily available. We actually stay on the phone with them, and to the extent they feel comfortable, check in with them and see if they can deal with the means. Like, can they put it in another room? Can they create distance? Can they move themselves somewhere else? One of the benefits of being on the phone or on the text is you can move with the person or move with the client where they're going. You also want to talk with them about getting a sense of their environment. We're going to talk a little bit more about the differences or just kind of considerations for text and phone, but what's true for both is we can't see the person. And so we're also going to ask questions, listen to understand, and get a sense of what is their environment like, right? Like painting a picture of, like, tell me where you are now. And you get to be with them in real time while they're trying to create some sort of safety around the means, which we'll also revisit.
The next thing we want to know, if they do have access to their means, Is there a time frame? Is there a specific timeline that is dated, or is it case by case if something happens? We want to take these into considerations if there's any other factors tied to making this timeline for them, such as when my kids have gone to college, or when I get evicted, when I lose this job, or when my relationship ends. And we also want to explore what could be their reasons for living. It could be people, it could be goals or deadlines that they could feel obligated to meet, or personal achievements that they have set to accomplish. And combining that with a validation or affirmation, like, it sounds to me like you're dealing with so much right now, and it really feels like more than one person can handle. I'm wondering if there's any people in your life who understand how you've been feeling that you can turn to for support.
So once we have an answer to these 6 questions, the different criteria, we have enough information to make a reasonable assessment about risk. And so we can conceptualize or visualize suicide on a kind of scale from 0 to 5, and then we think about it in terms of lethality. So somebody having no thoughts of suicide, no plans, no means, no intent, there's no risk, right? But as soon as we hear that there are some thoughts of suicide, even if they're fleeting, like they come and go, or they're occasional, or they have a faint desire, we can see that the risk starts to go up. So guiding yourself with an assessment using these questions with the person you're talking with kind of helps start to parse out, okay, someone said suicidal. We're not going to go straight from 0 to 5, right? We have to ask these questions to get a sense of where they are in terms of this scale. And so in lethality, right? Like, how close are they to imminent risk? Are they actively suicidal? Do they have a plan? Are they about to take action on a plan? Or if they have already taken action, right? That's an emergency situation there. But understanding where someone might fall on this scale is going to help us know how to respond. And also, we're making something that's very nuanced and layered and complex and gray, like black and white, right? And so sometimes people don't fit into exactly in one of these categories, but at least having a range like this helps us to start to frame, okay, what risk level are we working with, and what might I need to do next? Cici, I don't know if there's anything you want to add about the lethality scale.
You're good. Thank you.
Okay. So I know in some different settings, some people use the CSSRS, which is the Columbia Suicide Severity Reading Scale. We actually have 2 copies of the form available. We have like the long version, and we have a short one that, Sheena, when you get a chance, if you can drop in the chat for folks so they can have access to it. And we know that everybody is in different settings, or not in a work, like they're not doing this in maybe a work capacity, but they're doing this to kind of be more informed to support loved ones or people in their community. And so this is just a helpful reminder too of like how you can start to ask the questions and conceptualize it, right? So anybody saying yes to any of these questions, that's a time where like you can explore with them like what the next support looks like. And support looks different, and we'll talk about that. Support isn't just like behavioral health or therapy. Support is like connection to community, things like that. But then you can start to conceptualize here and maybe like a more condensed version of a lethality scale of, okay, like once these questions start getting answered, we see that the risk is increasing. So this is a tool that you could use in different settings, or just use the questions, keep them in your back pocket. So what does this look like over the phone, right? And so we talked a little bit about some of the challenges of, instead of sitting right across from somebody, what happens if this happens over the phone, right? Either you're talking to a friend, a loved one, your client calls, and suddenly there's mention of suicidality, or there's a suicide risk. And so without the ability to see someone in person, we really heavily rely on our other senses and listening to cues. We're really mindful of what we communicate, verbally, non-verbally, and we ask questions to show that we're listening attentively. So we use a lot of what we call minimal encouragements, like, yeah, I see, okay, to let people know we're there, because sometimes there might be silence on the phone, and that can be interpreted in different ways. And while silence is an incredibly powerful tool to use to give people space to respond, we also don't know what's happening with silence. We don't know what's going on with the caller, And likewise, if we're silent, they don't know what's going on with us. And so making sure that we're communicating verbally or non-verbally, that we're listening, or yeah, I see, or oh, okay. And also giving space for people to respond, but also checking in, I'm wondering if you're still thinking about that, or if you're still there. Or sometimes people even ask, like, are you there? It's like, yeah, I'm here and I'm listening, right? And so how do we make sure that we're letting them know that we're maintaining a question or a connection? And if we're silent, it's not because we're absent or we might not know how to respond, but we're giving people space, or that we're there and just listening. We also want to listen for cues. So this is especially like, we don't know where someone is, and we want to ask them and have conversations and get to know the people we're talking about, right? But if you're hearing background noises, asking if like the person's in a public area, or if they're at home, or where are they right now, or especially if you're concerned about means and access to means, like hearing the rattling of pills or assessing for what other noises are. We don't want to make assumptions. Like, our job is really to split hairs. We want to know specifically kind of what's going on, because we're not being investigators, but we're listening to understand. We want to get a sense of what's going on. So we really heavily rely on like what we are hearing on the phone. And then responding to that and being curious about it, to let the other person know we care, but we're also paying attention. We're worried, we're taking you seriously, and I'm wondering blank. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what this looks like through text.
Because we don't have tone of voice to convey emotional piece to our responses over text, we use a lot of complex reflections and strength-based affirmations. This can be done over the phone too, but we rely on motivational interviewing techniques to portray our active engagement over text. And motivational interviewing is a way to explore another person's motivations for or ambivalence towards change, while helping us to meet them where they're at non-judgmentally. And a key point in this is that we want to guide them to make positive changes by eliciting change talk, rather than directing them by giving them advice or jumping to problem solving immediately. Even when problem solving, we want to make that process collaborative and giving them power back to make that change themselves. Next slide, please. When a texter is ambivalent around change, for instance, this is an argument for change. I keep getting urges to cut sometimes. It's been 2 years since I attempted, but now that my depression is getting worse again, it's hard not to cut. The only thing that's keeping me from doing anything to hurt myself right now is that I just don't want to hurt my family or make them worry about me anymore. And it's an argument that they are making for change. And sustained talk looks like an argument that they're making against change, and could look like, I've been having really intense suicidal thoughts. Even though I know it might be best to go to the hospital right now, I'm hesitant because of the trauma that I've experienced at a psych ward a few years ago. Because of that experience, I've been having a really hard time with trusting doctors. The approach to take when engaging with change or sustained talk is to explore the client's ambivalence around change and understanding what's holding them back from pursuing that change. It's not to force them into changing by building a case for the healthier behavior. And I'm envisioning a seesaw. If pushed too far to one side, there's a risk of actually convincing them to do the opposite of what we want. And pushing them too hard to make a change before they're ready or willing might be met with more ambivalence, or what we might call resistance. Next slide, please. Double-sided reflections can also be a helpful tool for talking about suicide ideation. This is how we can go about in responding to the change or sustained talk. We can point out how strong these urges can be while there is a part of them that wants to stay alive, evidenced by them talking about it at the same time. And this is how we can build rapport over text. And an example of a double-sided reflection, if a texter has been saying, I've been thinking about dying a lot more lately, but I know I'd be too scared to do anything to hurt myself. I just don't want to be alive anymore. And we could say, on the one hand, I can hear how much you're wanting to escape the pain you're experiencing. And on the other hand, it sounds to me like there's a part of you that wants to stay alive because there's a reason you're texting us. Next slide, please. During the suicide assessment, it's important to remember asking more than one question at once can overwhelm the texter. It can make it likely for one of the questions to go unanswered, and we might have to ask again. So we recommend asking one question at a time. It also prioritizes in letting us know too which question to be asked first. If they have access to the means, is it with them right now? Are they planning on using it right now? And in imminent risk situations, it may be tempting to call emergency services or to send short, quick messages with just your questions. However, writing longer supportive messages with each individual question can help you convey empathy and maintain their connection and manage any anxiety that you or the person in crisis might be feeling if they're in imminent risk. We want to also look out for any changes in tone. Some examples of when the tone has changed could look like a difference in their suicidation, a length of messages, if they start abbreviating and responses get shortened to IDK or just K, or when the pacing, the flow of the conversation changes and there's a decrease in response time that could indicate reduced attention from any reasons like a technical spotty internet connection or grogginess or being under the influence of substances. An increase in response time could also indicate someone who's more activated, and we want to check in whenever we're noticing these changes. If the person in crisis is feeling overwhelmed, we can use chunked, shorter messages in noticing, or when they are overwhelmed, they will start using chunked, shorter messages. And that when we're noticing more frequent typos, it could also indicate a potential drowsiness from a suicide attempt, or when the person in crisis starts using a lot more punctuation, like dot, 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 or shortening down to just typing out emojis.
And so now that we've understood the different kind of nuances that might come up with the phone and the text, and also done our assessment and kind of gauged, right, where the risk level is. Now we're going to talk about how we respond to that. And so if we kind of think about it, right, from low risk to high risk, there's like these different areas they can fall. So we're going to go over each of these, and some of them will overlap. But if somebody is experiencing like low risk, right, like they might be very little risk to some risk, right, some fleeting thoughts, or occasional thoughts to I experience these regular thoughts, and sometimes I'm even considering maybe a plan, or they're going in that direction. We want to respond by identifying coping strategies and see like what are potential protective distractions, right? Low risk does not equal, okay, how do we get you to the hospital? How do we get you to the doctors? How do we figure out how to get you moving, right? We want to respond appropriately. So sometimes this could be, what helps you cope? Like, how have you dealt with these thoughts before? Have you taken care of yourself in different ways, right? Like sometimes when we're not able to take care of our basic needs or put them at the forefront, it can increase like feelings of crisis. So taking care of your personal basic needs can help with like de-escalation, or as well as reminding of like coping strategies they already have or exist. Or, hey, like, how do you usually cope with that? Or, hey, I know you told me that you take medication. Have you taken your medication today? Are you taking it as prescribed, right? What are some other places to reach out to for support as well, right? So after you're done talking with the person, because you assess that they're going to be safe, but they still have these thoughts, who else can they connect with, right? Are there warm lines? Are there helplines? Are there people in their support system? So there's different exploration around, okay, what can the person do to take care of themselves, and who can they also reach out to for support? And of course, again, I know people are in very different types of settings, and so you definitely want to follow whatever your organization is putting out there. But sometimes even if someone's low risk, you might want to follow back up. Our criteria is going to vary depending on that, but low risk doesn't mean no risk. So following up to like, what is your plan for reconnection with that person? But it's not an emergent situation is what we want to stress.
And when someone is at medium risk, we want to emphasize talking collaboratively on reducing their access to the means, hearing what their preferences for care are. So we would start with a small ask when we know that they have the means with them, and phrasing it as, can you put the pills or the means out of sight or move it into another room? And then going back into building rapport, exploring their story of why they're feeling this way, and collaborative problem solving, and then later followed by a bigger ask of means restricting again. Could you give the pills or the means to someone for safekeeping or put them somewhere that would be harder to access. Or even just asking them too, if you do find yourself going to grab it, can you let us know while we're talking? Their suicide risk could change in a matter of seconds and that they feel that they can't keep that away or out of sight.
Mhm.
And we want to respect that too, and just acknowledging if that happens, we want to be able to be looped in and to support you in keeping you safe.
Right. And then sometimes you might be talking to somebody that has the thoughts and they have access to means, but they're not readily available. You can still have that conversation of how to create safety around that or distance around that, right? When you're feeling this way, I'm worried that you might go for your pills. What can you do to try to keep yourself safe to reduce some access to that or other things that you can do?
And to make it collaborative as well, we can ask them what's around in their environment. What seems like a place that you can put it for now that will be out of reach, inviting them into this conversation of means restricting with you. Of what do you think seems like a good idea to you right now in keeping you safe? What are some barriers around you that we can use, whether it's people or using time as a barrier, such as like dropping a razor into a basket full of items and not having or using time to need to go through it to find it again. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. And we also want to explore the social network. If they're not safe to be alone, then who can be around them? Who can they go to? Do they have roommates, neighbors, or even just someone to give them a call and keeping them company over the phone or text? And there's places that they can possibly go to if they would like to voluntarily admit themselves. And Shayna, if I can get your assistance in dropping a link, it's a safe place for help, crisis clinics link.
Oops. Can folks see my screen?
Yes,
Okay, like that I'm on the internet.
yes.
Okay, great. So this is our 988alamedacounty.org. It's like a shared public facing website in collaboration with Alameda County Behavioral Health. And this is to help guide people to kind of understand 988 in Alameda County. And so one of the things when we're talking about support and access to resources, is a safe place for help. And so this is one of those options. And this is one of the links that'll be put in the chat as it's slowly loading. But there are actually community crisis referrals that everyone can look at so that if there is a place that someone needs to go to because they need extra support, they're not feeling safe, they're having difficulty de-escalating, we can see that right here. There's resources where it shows what the place is, when they're open, their phone number, and the services they provide and the client eligibility, right? So if somebody feels like they're needing a mental health evaluation or, they're having a crisis, this is a 24/7 location that they can engage with, including like there's detoxification services, short-term, non-clinical like crisis support programs that are 24/7. So these are community resources where people can go to or access. Also crisis stabilization clinics. So, right, somebody's at higher risk than low risk. Maybe they need a little bit extra support because we don't want someone to escalate to high risk. Maybe they're in that trajectory, or they're still in just such a state of crisis. Again, where can someone go to that's not necessarily like the hospital? And then there's also mobile crisis teams.
I wanted to add about the crisis clinics before we go on to mobile crisis
Absolutely.
teams. For crisis clinics, you don't have to be at imminent risk. It's anyone who could be low or medium risk and just needing a safe place to stay because they're noticing that, oh, I'm feeling intensely and I need a place to go that is not my own home right now. And crisis stabilization units, wellness centers are places that you can go voluntarily and also leave voluntarily too, so that it's different from being hospitalized on a 5150 hold.
Mhm. Thank you. That's so important because sometimes it's just that change of scenery, but also being connected with not just people that care, but like maybe mental health professionals that can respond to the folks. And then there's mobile crisis units. And so if, again, like we'll talk a little bit about how to do this like collaboratively, but if there are folks that are needing support, assessment, mobile crisis teams can go out in emergency crisis assessment situations, provide interventions. It's helpful for early interventions before the situation even escalates. They can do consultation, assistance with linkage to different programs, and 5150 evaluations. And a 5150 is the evaluation where if they're assessed to be like imminent danger to self, they can be taken to the hospital or be connected with appropriate levels of care that isn't the first thing is calling 911. So this is programs for like 911 diversion. And so there's a list of the different mobile crisis teams that are available, their times and how to access. And you can see like for some you might have to call 911 or have to go through a local dispatch, and others have different numbers. And so this is a really helpful resource because kind of like what Cici was saying about the crisis stabilization units and those types of clinics, you don't have to wait for the situation to escalate so high, right? This can help with de-escalation.
And another aspect that we would like to offer for anyone in considerable risk too is what Daniela mentioned too about outreach, offering a follow-up, and this could look like short term within the same day or the next day or within the next week. Or would you like for us to check back in with you later to see how you're feeling?
And then for folks that are at like high risk, right? If people are really high risk, like they're not feeling like they can de-escalate. Again, what are some other options before just thinking about going straight to the hospital? So are there respite or wellness centers or crisis stabilization units? It is important to know that like some crisis stabilization units, if folks are in imminent risk, that might not be the place for them. And there would be criteria on that. But that doesn't mean you can't call or go on the website and check that out. And if there is someone that does not feel like that they're going to be safe, right? So even if someone's lower risk than a high risk, they're low risk, they're medium risk, we're really basing also our assessment on how that person feels. If someone doesn't feel like they're going to be safe, we want to talk with them, explore supports, and then we explore each one until we find like what feels like the best support for the caller or that might be needed at the time. And so sometimes if someone is finding that they need to go to the hospital, again, instead of jumping to 911, or you're working with someone and you're like, wow, like, okay, we need to get you to that next or higher level of care. What are alternatives, right? Can we call a family member or friend together, right? If you're on the phone, or is there someone you could call that could take you there? Are you feeling safe to take yourself to the hospital if you feel like you're not going to be safe, right? So if all the other options for exploration around keeping safe around not hospital doesn't help, we can explore that option. And then of course, right, the mobile crisis team. It is really important to know, though, if safety planning is not possible and someone is having trouble de-escalating, sometimes you might have to call for emergency services. Ideally, this is something that you're doing with the person, with their consent, or being really transparent around, I'm really worried, I'm taking you really seriously when you say this. Is this something that you want? Do you want support? How do you feel about going to the hospital? What are your concerns? Let's talk about that. And we stay with them. Like if there are folks that are actually like, yeah, actually, that's what I want to do. I think I can have someone take me, or I can take myself. We can stay on the phone with that person, right? We can continue to check in with that person. That's something that you can do. And also providing post-emergency follow-up. If you know someone's going to the hospital because there's, that's an experience in of itself. Some people might find it really helpful. Some people might find it unhelpful and re-traumatizing, or right. There's a whole range of experiences. So having post-emergency follow-up is really important and helpful. Crisis support services has referrals for like follow-up programs. Like we follow up on folks that have, we know are going to the hospital, or that have let us know they've recently just been discharged, because we know the risk for suicide is exponentially higher when somebody leaves the hospital. And it is important
I
to
wanted
like,
to add 2 notes on the last slide too, sorry, Daniela, about adding on to your note about post-emergency follow-up, which is that any moment that a person is being discharged, that could be escalating them back to that moment of crisis, or even to a higher level of crisis, because of that adjustment back into reality. And another note about mobile crisis response team is, just because we're calling the mobile crisis response team does not always mean that that person is going to be taken to the hospital either. They can assist with hospitalization and transportation. However, that is not their priority either, that they're there to also check in on the person and to de-escalate and offer other safety planning options.
yeah. And then the person has to want mobile crisis to come out too. I think that's also important and a piece of like the collaboration. Thank you so much for adding that. And then to distinguish, imminent risk, right? If you've done an assessment and you're seeing that someone's an imminent risk, and also if they have already taken action to their plan, plan is in progress, they've already acted on it. This would now be considered a medical emergency, and this is how we frame that. And so that response is going to look differently. It's about, okay, the priority right now is their safety and medical attention. And so, of course, we still want to use our two-pronged approach of being really empathetic to ask questions, right? To get a sense of where they are, what happened, what's going on. But the goal is going to be, how do we get you to the hospital, right? So everything short of imminent risk, there's all these other options we can explore. And then when there's already this, then if the threshold is crossed, right, where there's action being taken, we have to treat that as such. Anything you want to add to this one, Cici?
I'm good. Thank you, Daniella.
Awesome. So just to kind of think about like this on a scale of less invasive to more invasive interventions, we always strive for the least invasive intervention, the thing that's going to disrupt someone's life the least. And we do that by exploring with what wellness and safety looks like for that person, right? Not our own kind of ideas of that, or if we're jumping based on anxiety or our nerves about wanting to help the person, we want to slow down, assuming that they haven't done anything to take action on a plan, right? If they haven't done anything, we have time, we want to buy time, we want to use our OR skills, our attending skills, our empathy skills, and our assessment skills to get a sense of what's going on and talk about them. Because the process of talking is also helps de-escalation too sometimes. So the least invasive would be working with that person. What does creating a safety plan look like, right? Who can I call in an emergency? Who are other people? Do they want to write that down while we're talking about it? What are resources, lines they can call, things they can do on their own, things they can do with other people, places that make them feel good. So it's really important that like there's a lot of good work that can be done with the lesser invasive options. That also includes doing a scheduled outreach call. I want to check in to see how you're doing. I know you're going to work on some of these coping strategies and you have a plan for what you're going to do to try to keep yourself safe. And then asking for consent. We use a lot of consent-based language around, is it okay to check back in with you? And then how we schedule that, or how we want to do that, or how we introduce the idea of wanting to check back in is also going to be determined upon how high their risk is, right? Are we checking back in tomorrow? Or are we checking back in an hour because you just de-escalated, but things are still pretty raw, pretty sensitive. So we definitely want to figure out how to get back in touch. We went over the crisis stabilization centers, having friends take them to the hospital, mobile crisis teams, and then of course, like hospitalizations or welfare checks. Like we want to let people know that, yeah, that can be really disruptive to people's lives. We want to try at all costs to mitigate any harm. And then I know sometimes there's situations where it may not be possible to maybe have this whole time to do the assessment because we're in an emergency situation, or you're not able to get a lot of information, or the phone hangs up, or they're not texting back, right? And we try to call back, we try to text back, or there's different reasons why we have to make the very, very rare but clinical judgment that like, okay, we're trying to be collaborative, but if they are saying that they don't want to be collaborative and they know this is going to happen, they're just not going to talk to us, right? We want to still work to get that buy-in and that support with, let's figure out how to help keep you safe. But if they're at imminent risk and we think not intervening is going to lead to a very likely chance that they're going to die by suicide, those are the very rare exceptions where we consider the last option, which is like an invasive, unexpected visit, right, from emergency medical services. We also want to talk about, so even though that this is a range of what is less invasive to more invasive, what feels invasive to one person may not be to another, right? So we want to also explore like what has helped in the past. Like maybe they're talking about a time that they got help because they went to the hospital and they found that really helpful, or that's where they felt safe. We want to be mindful of like, 988 is 911 diversion, but if someone is telling us that this is what they want to feel safe, you want to keep that in mind, right? Some people have really negative experiences with going to the hospital and some people don't. But we have to ask good questions. Kind of what Cici was saying earlier, if we just do an assessment and then we jump to trying to problem solve without getting a sense of what's going on with them, we're not going to get to learn more about that person, to hear about, well, what are the strategies or what are the experiences you had that either make this feel unsafe or safe? And then how can we learn more about that, learn more about you, so that we can take like a very sensitive, responsive approach to like, how do we explore engaging in possible other services, knowing that this has been scary for you, knowing that you may not have had a good experience, or hearing that this is what's important to you and what you value. So we always have to ask good questions, and we always want to collaborate. Any thoughts, any other comments on this, Cici?
Good too. Thank you.
Looks like we have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
And asked, how do you go about gathering information about clients' location in the case of imminent risk?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can say that we always try to be really collaborative. And so we want to ask like where someone is. That's often something I do early on in the assessment. And actually early on when I'm talking to folks, like I'm really curious just to get a sense of where our callers are, so we can orient ourselves to just knowing what community they're in to just start out with. And then I find that if we're waiting till people are telling us that they're at risk to start knowing and gathering more information, that can be really hard. But sometimes that's how it happens, right? We don't have that much time to talk to people, and then we hear that they might be at risk, and then we might need to know their location. I'm transparent about that, where I can be, I'm really worried about you. I want to get a sense of where you are right now. Do you feel safe where you are? Where are you currently? I do a buffet of options. Are you at home, or right? If you're picking up on signals. So those are things as well. A lot of people think that by calling 988, we have like geolocation, or we can see all that. We can't. Like, that's not something we can, or at least at this point in time, and we'll be very mindful as an organization of how to deal with that, but we don't have someone's location, right? And so we really rely on that rapport and information gathering from asking them those direct questions. Sometimes people may be more evasive when we're trying to ask those questions for different reasons. So I talk about talking about it, right? Like, why does it, why are you feeling apprehensive to share? Tell me what you're worried about. And then I let people know that, if we get to a place where I think, you're not feeling like you're going to be safe, I'm not feeling like you're going to be safe, then we can explore like what happens next. But for now, like, because I'm really worried, I want to get a sense of where you are. So I am transparent about like, yeah, I might need, your location in case this really escalates. Listening out for cues, getting to know where they are. And then in very, very like, kind of extreme circumstances where, let's say somebody is taken action, right? And maybe they're losing consciousness. Maybe the phone hangs up. They told us they were about to do something. That's when we would have to consider invasive options, because there's no other option. And we would call the emergency services or non-emergency police and see if maybe they already have an address on file. Sometimes cell phones can be pinged, but we're not CSI. We don't have the ability to see exactly where someone is. So we really hope through our empathy and collaboration and assessment that we can get as much information as we can. So I don't know if that answered your question, but Cici, I don't know if you want to add on to that at all.
I wanted to second what you said about the transparency and inviting them into the conversation of like, I'm hearing this is what you're telling me about your safety, and I'm concerned about what's going to happen as we continue talking today, and inviting them to of like, what could be some fears that you might have, or what could be some consequences that you might be wondering could happen of sharing or answering these questions that we're about to ask you.
Mm-hmm. Because then it shows that we care, right? We're not just doing it because we're like, oh no, we have to fulfill a mandate, or oh no, this is going to happen. It's like, I'm worried, I want to know about what's going on and how you're feeling, and let's talk about talking about it. And even talking about it can be de-escalating, and it shows that we're not just trying to check a box. I think your question also brings up like something very important, which is, we don't know what's going on when someone's like calling or texting us yet, right? And so we tend to want to do a suicide assessment really early, because we want to first normalize asking the question, right? People can feel this way, given that you're feeling this way. Are you feeling this way right now? Like picking up on those breadcrumbs, the things that we're hearing people say, because you could be talking to someone, and if you're not doing a suicide assessment and we don't know their risk level, we don't know if somebody's already taken action. We might not be able to tell. Maybe on the phone, you might hear cues like, you know, things and changes in speech suddenly, or changes in environment, and being curious about that. But like to Cici's point, like we don't always have those audio cues. So what do you do? So if we get a suicide assessment sooner than later, we can determine risk. And then that would also help you understand, like, wow, actually, I need to get some information before other things. If somebody says, yes, I'm suicidal, yes, I have a plan, actually, yes, I have the means and I've done something, or I'm like about to right now, and I can't de-escalate, right? I'm going to want to know to ask for things like, where are you, sooner than later. So that's why it's so important to consider, like, let's get through this risk. And then how do we do that in the most collaborative way, or this assessment, and do that in the most collaborative way possible. It's also important to, like, we really want to stress that, like, law enforcement, emergency medical services should be the last resort. And people have a lot of, I would say, like, horror stories from that, right? We've seen it ended up in death where that could have been avoided. And there's other possible less invasive interventions. So being really mindful that one of the reasons people don't open up and disclose that they're feeling this way is they're worried that someone might just call 911 on them, or they're going to end up in the hospital, or because that's happened to them. And so we want to be really mindful. And that's why that transparency piece is there when we're doing our assessment. But we just want to highlight that that's why 988 exists, right? Like a faster access to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, so that we can support people in crisis as part of 911 diversion. So we really, really want to just drive the point home that, like, responding based on assessment, based on risk level, is really important to help avoid unnecessary interventions that could lead to perpetuating harm.
And also that it's not a one and done. Just because someone is hospitalized, that doesn't mean that they're going to be rid of suicide for the rest of their life, that they're cured. It's hospitalization, emergency services interventions is more so just keeping their imminent safety in mind. And it's not so of dealing with the longer term options for support.
So when having the conversation, right, because we're talking about being collaborative and how do we ask these things, we want to be balanced, being direct and collaborative, right? There are times where we use open-ended questions, but there's times we need to be really direct and ask closed-ended questions. I really like asking for permission. Like, is it okay to ask where you are? Is it okay if I get your name? Like, consent-based language. How do you feel about this? What if we try this? Tell me, how are you feeling about that? Brainstorming together, especially when thinking about means or means safety or means restrictions or coping skills. Instead of suggesting things, like, the person's the expert in their own life. Let's hear what's helpful and what's not helpful, or let's be creative. Let's think about things together. There are times we want to guide people, right? So even though we're not coming up with solutions, sometimes we're going to be like, well, okay, while we're talking, like, let me help support you in staying safe. Why don't we put this in the other room? Why don't we try this, right? So even though we want to brainstorm ideas together, there are times where we're going to be more directive when there is a safety concern. So we can promote, like, safety and reduce risk. Getting a sense of the caller's environment, getting really creative, like exploring what their space is like. Exploring lots of different avenues for how they can either not have access to the means, restrict it, or get rid of it altogether. I think Cici gave a couple of, like, good examples. And then think of different distancing, right? Think of also being mindful that what are their means, right? If they have, like, let's say medication, we don't want to just be like, throw away your medication, because maybe they need it, right? So we want to be really mindful of their means. And also, we don't want to get in a power struggle with folks. Like, sometimes people might not feel comfortable to give up their means because it makes them feel safe or more in control. And sometimes people always have access to means, right? Anything can be a means. And I think sometimes that feeds into help or anxiety of, like, oh no, they're feeling suicidal, but they have access to this, this, and that. But doing an assessment to see what their plan is, and if those specific means are part of the plan, then it can kind of help reduce, help her anxiety, at least around, okay, well, not everything is a risk if they're saying this one thing is a risk, right? So being mindful about being creative about that one particular mean. And then we also want to explore the caller's like ambivalence and reasons. So being also really mindful, like I said, of not just if they don't want to get rid of it, but also if they feel comfortable engaging with it. We don't want folks to feel escalated because now they're engaging with their means. We want to make sure that they're feeling safe. And then if we talk about how we're feeling, we want to frame our feelings in terms of like supporting them, not saying, "Ooh, I'm feeling really uncomfortable because you have that knife." I want to say, like, I'm really worried about you. I'm worried that I think you might use that knife. So we want to be really mindful of how we frame our care and concern for the caller, that it's not our nervousness that this is happening. It's our concern that that you're feeling that way and you might act on that.
And at moments that you are noticing that discomfort coming up for yourself, just wanted to validate too that we're human, that it's okay to feel that way, but also just taking a step back and reminding yourself too that that focus is being mindful on how the I statements are being used in inserting yourself. Like Daniela said earlier, you can use it to express concern or care for why you're asking what you're asking. I ask because I'm concerned for your safety. And for instance, I know it can be difficult to talk about things like this. I'm checking in for your safety because you said that you've been feeling really hopeless and depressed lately. And I'm wondering if you're having any thoughts like that recently. Especially for situations that require emergency procedures, it's useful to get a second opinion on what you're about to conduct with the client. Have you done anything to engage them in a way that has built rapport? Have you been able to determine their current risk and been able to learn what they could be comfortable with in proceeding? Talking to someone about suicide can pull you into their crisis and get you also tunnel visioned by being present with the client. So asking a peer or a supervisor can help take a step back and reminding yourself of those considerations. It allows you also to get emotional support in handling that situation because debriefing can help with lessening feelings of burnout. Next, I'll be going into how we respond as humans and helpers in sustaining our own care. Working with people who are suicidal can take a toll on anyone. We're human as well. We're not meant to keep running without taking breaks and maintaining good care within ourselves. We can't pour from an empty cup. And that exposure to risk can lead to stress, which can manifest in many ways, such as compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. But what helps to counter that is the mindfulness and accountability of ourselves and understanding that there's a way to cope and that the work can be sustainable. I want to also acknowledge the fear that we may hold as helpers in our roles when we're hearing another person disclose suicidal thoughts. Fears such as thinking that the more we talk about suicide, the more suicidal it might make the client feel. However, inviting someone to talk about suicide as a conversation shows that we're taking what they're saying seriously and that we're asking because we care. And a person's willingness to talk about suicide is a sign of ambivalence in their feelings. It's signaling that they're trying in their own ways of meeting their needs. As highly empathetic individuals too, we may often be tempted to jump immediately into problem solving and advice giving upon hearing that someone is in distress. But living with suicide does not always mean that it's an emergency. And it's important to recognize our own limits of what can be offered, to be mindful of when our natural writing reflex kicks in, our desire to fix the issue at hand instead of just being in the moment with the person and their feelings. And that we're not trying to force them to change their mind, but rather trying to provide emotional support in order for them to feel empowered in making their own independent choices.
And I think to just highlight also being aware of our boundaries, people are balancing different things, right? Sometimes people are balancing, am I doing the right thing? Or do I have this mandate? Or my job is telling me to do this? Or I'm really worried about this person and it's so hard to, how do I get off the phone, or how do I stop talking about that when they told me all of this happens, right? And so we want to be mindful, you want to be aware of your boundaries, but also that's why if we do a really thorough assessment and we understand the difference between low risk, medium risk, and high risk, imminent risk, right? Kind of trusting that like you were supportive, you were there to talk to them, you got a sense of they're safe right now, if that is true, and talked with them about a plan, right? So there can be anxiety on like letting the call go or letting the text go, but being mindful that we are trusting what the person is telling us in addition to our assessment that they're going to be safe, and just kind of remind ourselves of that.
Some ways to maintain self-care is to lean on communities of care around you so that the onus isn't on you. Finding a ritual to do before, during, and after you have these conversations. Seeking support whenever you can in your social support systems, taking breaks to unplug virtually, and just reminding yourself too that knowing that there's limitations in what we can do and it being okay with those limitations as well, that we want to treat ourselves and our community with the same care and consideration that we're providing for the people we're helping.
Yeah. And just like some of our own internal like CSS values are around, you know, reaching out early and often, like care from the inside out, like welcoming levity, like the work is really hard, and this is a really big topic, right? And it like this can be like a unique but shared experience that people have. And so having people that you can talk with, like I'm so grateful to have Cici to talk with and doing this work, having our team to talk with, right? Making sure to check in with yourself. I know for me, I do things because I'm talking about suicide all the time, right? And death all the time. Doing things for me that feel like life-giving. So, and reminding yourself that like self-care, I know people feel a type of way about that word. And we talked about it, right? Sometimes the onus is on the self, but it could look different ways of community care. It's a ongoing, proactive, preventative process. It's oftentimes harder to take care of ourselves after something has happened, right? Or remembering to do that good self-care. But if we establish something regularly, that can help mitigate. So it's really important to just be mindful of that and find what works for you. It can be ritualistic. It could be, changing rooms, changing environments. It could be connection to support. So it looks different. Everyone's self-care and ways they take care of themselves after this is going to look different. Right. And so we're going to stop sharing and leave a kind of room for questions or comments that people had that came up at all during the presentation. Just about the work. All right. You're also welcome to put it in the chat. Looks like Sheena put a resource for the mobile crisis teams. I just kind of want to let folks know. So calling us, you can call us through either our local crisis line or through 988 if you're routed to us from we're local to you. You don't have to be suicidal to call. Like suicide prevention is also mental health maintenance. Right? You don't always have to be in like a suicidal crisis to call. And if you have more questions or you're concerned about a loved one or another person, we do have third-party callers, is what we call us all the time, like wanting to get more information, learning how to assess. We also at CSS have community education where they go out into the community and they educate people on how to assess, how to respond, and specific trainings, right? Either we have some going on today, like either for youth or for medical professionals. So we're a resource, not just the agency, but also our crisis line. So know that we're there for you and we're there for those that need support. See somebody had their hand raised.
Hi, I just want to appreciate all the attention and detail to providing those reframings of what words to use. I found that as a therapist in those moments, I've like referenced virtually a lot of when I've had to do this myself. And so the wording has been so helpful in the moment that you can have something to anchor yourself with and ground yourself with and slow it down when so this is so real. And so thank you for making it like a tool that's very accessible and clear. And yeah, just thank you for the work you do. It's been really helpful to the clients that I work with, to the families, and to me to continue to not feel this is overwhelming, and normalize and just kind of really reassure them it's going to be okay.
Thank you so much for saying that. And thank you for the work you're doing with folks and responding and having that place where they can share that. Yeah, like we want to normalize that. Yeah, I can feel all these kinds of ways, but we also want to normalize talking about it. And so I'm glad that you found that helpful.
I wanted to second that too. Thank you for being here. And thank you for naming too, like in those moments as a helper, that those feelings of discomfort can come up, and those countertransference feelings of feeling just as alert as the person in crisis can come up as well. And so I appreciate that feedback too, that there are statements, and also just inviting the client and just being with you in that moment of like, I hear that you're feeling a lot right now too. And I'm wondering, what can we talk about? What can we do to just take a breath right now before we go back into having more questions or talking about collaborative problem solving?
And I also think like the tools to use, right? Like when you're talking about the anchor you said, sometimes people are afraid. I talk to people all the time about this. Like they're afraid to ask the question because they're afraid to hear the answer for different reasons. And I think that's a good thing to explore for yourself. Like if you're feeling nervous to ask the question, why? Is it your own anxieties or around how you're going to respond, or the concerns? Am I, do I know how to respond? Is it the concerns around what if they say yes? And so we want to remind folks, like we ask the question because we do really want to know, and how can we proceed with that assessment and be empathetic so that we are getting the answers that, will be helpful to make an assessment or to respond to people. And so I know it can be hard to ask the question, but sitting with like, why does that feel hard? And hopefully that you have like some things in your back pocket of like, okay, well, it's because I asked and I want to respond, and how can we have a conversation, right? And so as soon as you make the determination that someone's safe, like you can buy all the time in the world, buy time. Like this is your time to talk to people, get to know them, and show them that like, I can talk about this. And it doesn't result in going to the hospital all the time. And actually it can feel good to talk about it. So